Well, I'm delighted to introduce to you this morning Bob Bevil.
Good morning.
Bob is employed at Chipping Barnet Foodbank, thanks to a grant from the Trussell Trust. And the grant is for 3 years to enable Bob to work borough-wide on addressing poverty and attempting to alleviate poverty across Barnet. So I'm going to be asking Bob some questions. We're going to be having a bit of a chat. Bob's got a couple of slides that we'll come to in a little while. I just want to explain a little bit about the slides before Ray shows them to us. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers from your good selves. So if you've got some difficult questions, I'll ask Bob to address them. If they're easy ones, I don't mind having a crack at them. But Bob, so who are you? What are you doing here?
So good morning, everybody. First and foremost, I just want to thank everybody for the invitation, Andrew and Helen. A wonderful introduction to the Trussell Trust, so thank you very much, Helen. My name is Bob Bevil, and I'm employed at Chipping Barnet Foodbank. You may or not be aware as to where Chipping Barnet Foodbank actually is. It's only 200 metres away at St Peter's Church in Somerset Road. I was born and bred in Barnet. I grew up on the Dollis Valley estate in Maze Lane, if anybody's familiar with that. And I was educated locally at St Catherine's, and I went to school in Finchley. So I've lived my entire life in EN4 and EN5. And my role at Chipping Barnet Foodbank is advocacy and campaign lead. And what that means is that I facilitate wherever I can the voices of the individuals and families that have to come to receive emergency food at the food bank. So I effectively facilitate the voices of those people experiencing poverty and destitution with a view to having a future without the requirements for food banks in the London Borough of Barnet, Andrew.
So who do you advocate with? You advocate for the people who haven't got a voice. To whom do you speak for them?
Well, that's a really great question. So first and foremost, anybody who will listen, but you will understand with the experience of poverty, there are certain drivers that sit behind that. So for example, we're all familiar with the cost of living crisis. We're familiar that the essentials, the basics to enjoy life are now far more expensive than they were, and things like benefits and wages haven't risen in the same way to meet that demand. So really the people that we advocate to, present to, are anybody to do with the structures that drive that poverty. So an obvious example, I don't know if anybody lives in local authority housing, but the rent is going up in October. So of course, that shortfall will need to be met in other ways. So for example, one of the things I might do is present the case of food bank clients to the council, to the London Borough of Barnet, to see what we can do to alleviate that particular driver of poverty.
Another part of your job is campaigning. Again, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, of course. So when I meet clients in the food bank, you get to know them, you get to have conversations and find out what's going on in their lives. And sometimes that can be quite traumatic for the clients to share. But what we can do in those conversations, and the volunteers are an integral part of this, they have the conversations and we learn about what's happening in people's lives, particularly with the experience of poverty. And what we can do is we can start to identify some of those issues that our clients are experiencing in their day-to-day lives. And if we can identify those issues, what we can then do, the next step, is to bring a body of people together, whether that's volunteers and clients, and campaign together to address the issue we've identified. So a very good example at the moment, and I've come back to the London Borough of Barnet again, it's not all the London Borough of Barnet, is that there are some real challenges about the experience of damp and mould in local authority housing. So we've actually, in partnership with the Citizens Advice Bureau, or Citizens Advice Barnet, presented a case to the council to work around that issue of alleviating the challenges of mould and so forth in people's houses. That's just one example of campaigning that we've done in partnership with Citizens Advice. So it's not just me alone, it's the volunteers, it's our clients who are expressing themselves to us, and other interested parties that are compassionate, like Citizens Advice Barnet.
Helen mentioned that the Trussell Trust's aim was to have a society without the need for food banks. And I know that Chipping Barnet Food Bank have developed their own local strategy to alleviate poverty in the borough. And that's a matter of changing communities, changing minds, and changing policies. Do you want to pick up on that at all and say how your role fits in with that, Bob?
Absolutely, and you've just identified the 3 pillars that the Trussell Trust has put in place with reference to my role. So if we take changing communities first, my role is very much around engaging with other community partners. This is a very good example of it, to challenge the idea that, or to challenge the stereotyped idea of what clients may be like that come to the food bank. So, for example, I often do lessons and assemblies in the local schools to lay out the objective facts of the reasons why clients come to the food bank. So we quite often assume, for example, that people who come to the food bank are unemployed. Now that's not the case. So, for example, Finchley Food Bank has just published a report where they discovered that 37%, or a figure of that ilk, of the clients that come to that food bank are actually in employment. So that's actually a fact that we know is accurate, but it's not a fact that's known in the broader community. So in terms of changing communities, my role is very much around providing objective information about the experience of food banks. And by the way, if you didn't know this, there are 22 registered food banks in the London Borough of Barnet, which is more than the number of McDonald's. So that says a lot in and of itself, I believe. Changing policy links very much to what you were just saying about campaigning. So what we're really keen to do is identify the drivers of poverty and destitution in the London Borough of Barnet, and then channel that energy to present to those people who control the policies, government, central government, or local government, with a view to making a change in the overall management of poverty and destitution. And finally, changing mindsets, which is very much around this idea of facilitating people to come together to challenge the reasons and the drivers that are associated with poverty in the local area.
And the Trussell Trust have got this model, haven't they, of addressing all the various facets that go to cause poverty in the first place. Would this be a good time for us to think about the slide then?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it will give our audience, our congregation here today, an idea of what actually happens 200 metres down the road. Yeah. And, you know, when people come to the food bank, what are we trying to do to support and alleviate the poverty that our clients are experiencing?
The slide which Ray will show in a minute or two will be difficult to read from where you're sitting. It's a beautiful slide created professionally, but with a screen the size of this, you won't be able to read it. So what we've done with the help of Rashia, thank you Rashia, is to cut this in two, so you will be able to read it. But maybe the central part of it, you might just want to talk us through with the bit they can read.
I mean, to put it in a very kind of, well, I say it's not Let's see if the pointer.
There we go, yeah.
There you go. So if you have a look at the middle of the diagram, it says a future where no one needs a food bank. So I've got a very bizarre job description, which is to make myself unemployed as quickly as possible, because we really do want to have a future without the requirement for food banks. And this inner blue ring is really the sort of construction of local society. We've got governments, communities, businesses, and we've got individuals and families. And the outer ring are the values of the Trussell Trust: compassion, dignity, community, and justice. So by integrating those values in the society that we live in this case, Barnet, the idea is to create that future where no one needs a food bank. And what you see on the outer rim is some research that's been conducted by the Trussell Trust and with other partners, for example, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where we can make a difference. And this is where my role really comes into play. So it's about, supporting people with...
Should we use the bigger slide on this one? Would that help?
That's it, yeah,
If
perfect.
you move on to the next one, Ray.
Yeah. So dignified support for disabled people and people with health conditions. Okay, that's on the left. Then we've got a supportive social security system at the top. And on the right-hand side, easy access to advice and support on money matters. Now, just very briefly, there is this view that people come to food banks, collect food, and then leave. That's actually not the case, and it's certainly not the case at Chipping Barnet Food Bank at St. Peter's Church. So when people come to us initially, before they collect the food, they've been referred to us by organisations in the community. We do our very, very best to try and address some of these background issues. So, for example, in every Chipping Barnet Food Bank distribution session, we will have an officer from Citizens Advice Barnet present, so we can actually look at how we can support that individual with reference to any of these issues on the outside of this particular diagram. So, for example, an individual might be entitled to a PIP payment, which is for disability. Now, if that individual doesn't have it, we have the resources and the skills on site to ensure that that individual is supported accordingly. So there's a whole range of drop-in support and advice. So the council sit with us, Citizens Advice sit with us. We have an employed signposter who will actually redirect people to other agencies for help. So it's a very robust service, Andrew. It's not come and collect your food and leave. It's almost like a small social services department in and of itself. And we're very proud of that. And in fact, within the Trussell Trust, we're acknowledged as one of the finest practitioners in the country in how we try and alleviate poverty at Chipping Barnet Food Bank. So you might see on the right-hand side, just one more example on this slide perhaps, easy access to advice and support on money matters. Now, as a community of people that support, we've approached the council to say, well, what can we actually do to support our clients? And as a result, and this is an example of change in policy, the London Borough of Barnet has now put a benefits calculator on their website. So anybody can access it, put in your details, and it will tell you if you're entitled to more than what you already have. You will not believe how much untaken benefit there is in our society. So it's well worth just going on there, having a check, because you might be entitled to something that we didn't even know about. And that certainly happened for me personally as well, I have to say, because I'm a little bit deaf. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that good?
Thank you. Yeah. Should we go on to the next slide, Ray?
So, I mentioned there's quite a few folk who are looking for work, and this is just another example. And of course, by having work, one generates an income and one might then not require the food bank again. So examples of other drop-in centres that we have, or drop-in supports we have at Chipping Barnet Food Bank is an organisation called Boost, which is a branch of the London Borough of Barnet, and it's responsible for supporting people into the workplace. So they will also be available as a drop-in support. And I think in the interest of time, I'll mention one more. We do have a charity that comes in who are very good, and they're called the Shore Trust. And they help people get work, do CVs, do interviews, and also help people move jobs and get promoted. So the idea there is to support people in the workplace or to get a job, thereby alleviating the requirement of having to come to the food bank. So I think the takeaway story just from the slides is, please consider the food bank, yes, as primarily here's the food, but the real issue and the real drive is to try and not be there in the first place through the provision of what we call upstream services. Yeah. Okay, so I hope I've given you an idea of what our intentions are and what we are trying to do at Chipping Barnet Food Bank. And remember, it's one of 22 food banks in the London Borough of Barnet.
One of the slots on the right there, readily available mental health and trauma-informed support.
Yes.
Am I right in saying that Chipping Barnet Food Bank still has somebody who comes along who is a mental health specialist? Grow, live, live, what I've forgotten the name of the phrase.
So, yes, so that's a really good question, Andrew. And so for each of these segments, we do have a drop-in support. So when we look at mental health, we do have access to two mental health support services. One is Mind in Barnet and Enfield, so we can refer to a crisis team there if individuals need support when it comes to mental health. And I think you were trying to say Change, Grow, Live.
Change, Grow, Live. I couldn't remember the name of it.
So we have every, I can't remember, I think it's maybe once or twice a month, we have an organisation called Change, Grow, Live that come, and Change, Grow, Live are what we would describe as a drug and alcohol support team. So you might imagine that we cover a very vast population in terms of diversity when it comes to our clients at Chipping Barnet Food Bank, and we do our hardest and we try our very hardest to be able to embrace everybody and take into account their needs with a view to alleviating deprivation and poverty. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Another organisation that I know is linked with Chipping Barnet Food Bank is Christians Against Poverty, and they come along once or twice a month?
Yes, they do, yes. So Christians Against Poverty will, very similar to Boost, will, they actually specialise in debt management. Yeah. So if there's a requirement for support with debt, Christians Against Poverty are excellent. Beth is a really, really good person to speak to in relation to that. And what we're starting to do now with all these different services, we're actually starting to build a database of the number of people that no longer need to come. So we are making progress in terms of a future where no one needs a food bank, but we're working in a context of all these societal pressures, cost of living, rents going up, mortgages going up, bills, etc., etc. Those external pressures are still there to be dealt with. So while we have some people who no longer need the food bank, we've also got people who do need the food bank. So there is this cycle and churn of clients that we're always working with.
Would this be a good time to open it up to any questions from the congregation?
Absolutely. Any difficult questions we can ask Andrew.
And
it should be
Alison,
picked up on this microphone, I think.
Yeah.
This is an election year. You've already mentioned that you go to sort of meet with the councillors. I wondered how many councillors or MPs have been to the food bank. And then secondly, if we do encounter any of the candidates, both local elections or perhaps later in the year for the national elections, what should we be asking them? what's the most important thing to challenge them about? I mean, maybe it's just how do you propose to get rid of food banks?
That is such a good question, and I'm slightly uncomfortable with, like a political question. I'm in a church and I've got a political response, but I can give you factual response to the question. So I started my role about 10 months ago, and I made a point of inviting every single councillor in the London Borough of Barnet to visit. You may or may not know that the London Borough of Barnet is a Labour-controlled local authority, and I can confirm that we've had 15 councillors visit, in the range of 15, 3 Conservative, 12 Labour, and in addition to that we've had a mayoral visit and we've had a deputy mayoral visit, and in terms of parliamentary candidates, we have had a visit from a gentleman called Dan Tomlinson, who is the Labour candidate for Chipping Barnet. Again, everybody has been invited, and our current MP hasn't visited as yet, although there is an open invitation.
She did visit a few years ago, I
Yes.
think, but has not visited of late.
Yes, not visited of late. So Chipping Barnet Foodbank, for those of you who don't know, opened in 2012. Is that right, Andrew?
Yep.
Yeah, and our incumbent MP has been in place since 2002. Okay, so that's the sort of the political bit. In terms of what should we be asking the politicians, I would defer back to the Trussell Trust for this. So the Trussell Trust have been running a campaign for the last year or so called Guarantee Our Essentials, and that's at a national level. So what the Trussell Trust are asking is for an increase in universal credit. So if there's a policy answer, that's what the Trussell Trust would be saying. We need an increase in universal credit so that families and individuals can guarantee, and this is Trussell Trust language, guarantee the essentials. Because of course, the cost of most things has gone up, but what hasn't gone up proportionate to that is our basic welfare, which is in the UK, universal credit. Thank you for a great question.
John?
Yeah, can you tell us how many customers? Can you tell us how many customers turn up for the food bank in Chipping Barnet, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do 2 sessions a week, if you're not aware. We do a session on Saturday from 10 a.m. to midday, and we do a session on Tuesdays from midday to 2 p.m. If anyone's interested in volunteering, by the way, please come and have a conversation with me after. And I would say on average, John, we feed about 120 people we give food to feed about 120 people per session. Perhaps on a broader scale, you won't see 120 people at the food bank, by the way, because often parents will come to collect for a whole family. So you won't see hundreds of people queuing up in the street. An interesting broader point, though, is I wrote an article for the Barnet Post about 6 months ago. And what I did is extrapolated Chipping Barnet's figures times 22. So we've got a figure for the borough. And the conclusion that we drew, and I've had this validated by the council, and in fact they suggested that my approximation might be conservative, if anything. The London Borough of Barnet is feeding emergency food to the equivalent of 100,000 people per year. And in the article I suggested, think about it, it's like filling Wembley Stadium once a year. And then if you extrapolate that further, interestingly, we're one of 33 boroughs in London. So now, when you start to do the multiplication and the extrapolation, what we've got here is a significant social issue, which I think, going back to the previous question, politicians should be taking far more seriously. We don't hear very much at all about emergency food provision or food poverty in, you know, a lot of the hustings and the political conversations that are going on at the moment. And I think when you look at the numbers like that as well, it starts to challenge that idea of, you know, people scrounging or just appearing because they're lazy. It's simply not true, and the numbers are testimony to that. John, that's a great question as well, thank you.
Yeah, last year, Chipping Barnet Foodbank fed 6,200 people, and that was the highest ever in the 10 years that it's been open, even higher than the peak year in 2020 when the pandemic was at its worst. So the numbers, the graph is going up. There was a peak at 2020, dipped a bit then after that, after the pandemic, and it's now going up higher than it was at that stage. So things aren't getting any better, that's for sure. Other questions? Ros?
And just a question for Andrew. You modestly haven't mentioned that you were chair of the food bank for many years. So what have you learned in doing that?
Wow.
That's a great question.
I think one of the things I've learned is there but for fortune, go you or I. Bob's mentioned that you know, the typical person who comes to the food bank, there's no such thing as the typical person who comes to the food bank in that sense, that a lot of people can just have some bad luck and they fall through the system. I've learned that the government support systems through universal credit, as it now is, serves people pretty badly, frankly. In the very early days, most of the people who are coming to the food bank were because of either delays in benefits or sanctions for frivolous reasons, really. So people were not getting the benefits that they should have done. So very much that it is a national political choice, frankly. I'm happy to talk politics. It's a political choice that people are in the situation that they are in, sadly. I think another thing I've learned is the incredible energy of the volunteers that are willing to spend their time and energies and skills in trying to alleviate the poverty that's in the area. We've got, or is it, Bob, going on 200 volunteers at Chipping Barnet Food Bank on shifts, you know, rotas that. So there are three things, Ross.
Just very briefly to add to that, prior to doing the job I do now, I have quite an extensive career in corporate teams. And I have to say, the volunteer team could knock the socks off of some of the corporate teams that I've worked with. They're absolutely phenomenal group of people. They really are, really are. In fact, I wonder what would happen without them. And that's the real thought process. If we were to take volunteers away, not just from Chipping Barnet Food Bank, but in general, and imagine if the volunteers went on strike. You know, I think we would come to a grinding halt in the United Kingdom. So I can't credit that team. I'm lost for words to try and describe what they do.
And during the pandemic, it was open the whole time during the pandemic, and the volunteers took the risk themselves and came in and opened the doors and provided the services. More limited, nothing like the kind of range of services that Bob's talking about this morning, but the basic essentials were provided. Have to take our hats off to the people who are doing that. Thank you, Ros. Yeah. Other questions, or? In which case, a big thanks Bob for coming along this morning. I think Bob's job, in a sense, is to try and put this model into reality in the London Borough of Barnet, addressing all the various things that around the outside there, with a view to achieving what's in the middle, which is a world without food banks. So very many thanks, Bob, and thank you for your questions. Okay.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you.